Excited to be back for the Swiss View. Today we're going to be covering a lot of issues. There's been a lot going on in Europe, in China, in the US. I think it'd be great to start talking about Germany. They recently, just this week, passed easing their debt brake. So there's going to be quite a lot of money flowing into various sectors. Maybe you could give kind of a breakdown of what's just taken place in Germany.
So even before that, I think last time we spoke about that Germany has a new chancellor or like a new government. So they will be put in place next week. But the already elected Friedrich Merz, he already made kind of a U-turn regarding the debt brake, saying he wants to loosening it. Before, when he was running for chancellor, he said, I don't want to do that. But now they decided with the old government, under the old government, with two other parties, they needed 2/3 of the votes, that they are going to increase their debt spending by 500 billion. So easing the debt brake there. And then on top of that, they decided that everything that is spent on defense for the time being will not affect the debt brake at all.
Interesting.
Yes.
Yeah.
So it's not final yet, but it's pretty far. So the upper house or whatever it is called still has to decide on Friday, but it looks like it will happen.
Yeah, it definitely got enough votes, more than 2/3 vote from the parliament. So that was interesting to see kind of the overwhelming support of that and the desire for the economic stimulus that, Germany's been struggling economically.
Right.
Their markets did well last year in terms of the stock market, not anything like home runs, but, did pretty well. But their economy is still struggling. And for, the last 2 years, they've been very strong on their debt brake and not giving any kind of stimulus to try to push economic activity in the right direction. And so where I'm not a fan of ever increasing debt. I think it can be used in moments and should be used in moments to kind of give a little bit of a boost. And then once that boost takes place, return back to the discipline and the conservative nature of managing that debt. As long as it doesn't run out of control, I think there can be times where government debt can actually help just to give a nudge. And so it is an interesting move. Go ahead.
Yeah, maybe the only issue which we have there and which we have seen in history a couple of times is there is a saying, there is nothing more constant in politics than a temporary measure.
Absolutely. If there were politicians, especially on the budgeting side, who had a little bit of restraint or the ability to pull back, I agree. That's where, from the economic mindset, you think, it could be good for that moment, but then, reel things in a little bit, pay off your debts. And we've seen that historically has not often been the case. I mean, Switzerland put their debt brake in because they didn't, the population put it in. They didn't want their debt to go any higher. So, there always is that struggle, but it is still interesting in that. I think also what's interesting to see is the ECB and their most recent, the European Central Bank, they reduced their interest rates by 25 bips.
Yeah.
So it's sitting at, I think, 2.5% now. The main interest rate,
right,
about right there, which is quite interesting to see. The bond markets are acting 50-50 on it. Some I'd say bond bulls are excited, but others are also a little bit more tempered in their excitement.
Yeah, I think the temper comes from Germany's decision to easing the debt brake. We have also seen the 10-year government bond yield going up as a result of this decision, which is also understandable.
Yeah, it is interesting. I mean, and on that kind of interest rate decisions, we have the U.S. Is going to have their interest rate decision today. Yeah. And tomorrow, I believe, is Switzerland, correct?
So maybe we should clarify what date today is. So we are talking on
True.
March 19th.
Good point. March 19th. That's right. Yeah.
So slightly before the interest rate decision, expectations for the U.S. are that they stay where they are. For Switzerland, more or less too, but Switzerland usually is less predictive than other central banks, which is kind of a good thing.
Yeah, and I think when you look at the economic environment of the three kind of where the central banks are acting, you have the EU that's or the European or Euro area that's kind of struggling to get out of some slow moving economies. Some economies are moving better than others. Spain is doing all right. The numbers look okay in Italy, but some problematic stuff. Germany, still not growing their GDP to where they would really want it to. Unemployment is not excessively high, but still higher than where they want it. But inflation is kind of coming back in the right direction. In some countries, it's below, they're 2%, but overall, it's still above that 2% target rate.
Right.
And similar in the U.S. I mean, inflation has now seemingly been at around 3%, flirting just underneath 3%, flirting above.
Right.
And it creates kind of a tough or the right environment to go either way, dovish or hawkish. And where we see the ECB, in a different economic situation where the U.S. is still kind of projected to grow in its economy and the numbers hold up with their double mandate. So they have a little bit more room to be hawkish, where the ECB is more in a place where they need to be a little bit more dovish to try to help the economy to a certain extent, but not go too far.
Right.
And Switzerland, sitting now under or within their target inflation for over a year.
Yeah.
The economy is growing, but not moderately. Nothing that would make us get too excited and run out the door. What are your kind of thoughts when you look at the situation and where it's kind of headed for those kind of three separate areas? And is there anything interesting that we should be looking at?
Yeah, I think what is interesting is that the market in the US is reacting quite negatively about the insecurity about tariffs, but also about the spending restrictions through Doge. And then at the same time, we have Germany and Europe in general, where there is more acceptance of additional spending. And also there was a discussion about the ECB and EU in some sort financing some expenses on the defense side. And I pretty much agree with you that I don't think that increasing debt is a good thing, but there are always two sides to that. So we have seen that with this huge infrastructure programs in the past in different economies, and the individual companies, they will start to benefit out of that. If they get like new orders, if they get new projects in, that's a good thing for them. And what is another part is also in Europe, what we've seen from the European Union is that there is finally some sort of movement towards deregulation as well, which I would argue is pretty much pushed by what the US is doing, so that they realize, okay, we have to deregulate to a certain extent as well, because businesses thrive through a certain point of regulation, but if you over-regulate, it will take away most or a significant part of innovation. And that is important, because I just read an article today which was also again eye-opening. I mean, the internet was invented in Europe, even in Switzerland, but it was scaled in the US. And so there is a certain issue in the Europe area where through regulation it is pretty hard for some companies or some industries to thrive.
Yeah, absolutely. I think especially when you get into the scaling issue is first the expertise. It's not that companies can't scale in Europe, but you have to have a very good team that understands the regulations that you have to navigate to scale. Right. And that's expensive. So the costs then go up, and it's much harder to scale and pull profit out of it when I can develop a product in Europe and then go to an environment like the US and scale it much quicker and figure out those regulatory hurdles of Europe after I've scaled, after I have enough finance that I can find the right people to then present that back to the European market. And that absolutely puts a pressure on the ability to move a business, to let the innovation thrive in where it was founded, where it was produced. And that certainly puts a challenge. I think the other side is the mentality of people, of where the US, that's, it's always had it's had less regulation, and it's allowed for some crazy explosions, challenges as well and negatives, but crazy explosions, but also the mindset of the people that are in those economies, I mean, if you look at where the markets are, you brought up the markets where European markets are doing quite well this year, where the U.S. markets are kind of struggling to take off. Um, and the economy in the U.S. is doing okay, but I would say is in a turbulent situation. Not sure which direction it's going to go. And Europe's in kind of a bad situation. The economic sentiment in the U.S. is way higher than in Europe, even though things are going decently well for companies in Europe.
But it's going back dramatically, and the U.S. market didn't had a good start as well until the mid-February, and then it started to deteriorate. Sure. And from the very high, the S&P 500 is now in correction territory, or has entered correction territory, and that's mostly caused by insecurity. What the markets or like the economy will make out of it is a different story. But it is really interesting how the markets in the U.S. are negative while the markets in Europe are a double-digit up. And this kind of dispersion, the question always comes up, is that sustainable? And I would argue if we see this kind of spending that was now announced, plus if we see some kind of easing in regards to the war in the Ukraine, I could very well imagine that this year will be the start of a more thriving economy again in whole of Europe. Because even though, let's say, everything goes back to 2 years in regards to how geopolitics works, there would still be the desire from European countries to invest more into defense, to invest more into infrastructure, because they don't have this kind of trust anymore into their partners. And for the long term, I think that was important, this wake-up call, that they realize, okay, look, this peace dividend we had, that's not forever. And we have to do something if we want to keep our position in the world and our wealth generated over the decades.
Yeah, absolutely. The sustainability and the relevance of Europe and each country that makes up the European Union. I think another interesting area that we can look at that would be fascinating to kind of pull into the picture. Now we've been talking a lot about the West, and I think that's very important, but also looking a little bit further east into China and what's kind of going on there, because China's been in quite a bit of turmoil the past couple of years, struggling with not growing the same amount that they've been growing, falling domestic market interest in producing, their domestically driven economy, because they've relied almost not solely, but heavily on foreign direct investments and companies setting up and tapping into their markets. And you brought up a very interesting point about China that I think is worth sharing about where they're trying to stimulate their economy.
Yeah, I mean, they have tried several things to bring back the growth in the economy. They claimed that they got the 5% GDP growth last year, which is very much questioned.
Highly debated.
Highly debated, right. But they see that there are issues, and they see they need to do something to reinitiate the drive of especially domestic demand. So they initiated a program where if you buy a new electronic device, you will get a subsidized, so it will be cheaper for you. And so they try to get people bringing their old electronic device into the shop, buying a new one, and get the subsidized through that.
That's very fascinating. You growing up in a historically farming family, you saw the subsidies that were given in the U.S. to farmers. Buy a certain type of equipment, get a certain subsidy, make sure that it's spent on that, or we're planning to do X, Y, and Z, get a subsidy for that. And so it's interesting to see that China's taking a even wider spread kind of subsidy of like every individual could get a part of it, which is unbelievable to try to comprehend in my head of what that can do, what are the effects, what are, how much stimulus will it create, how much more flow of finances within the country will it create, and will it be able to make up for the real estate collapse that they had and the challenges where so much wealth was, preserved to a certain extent in these investments.
And I think it also shows how they are trying to open up to a certain extent, because the concept of doing that is not new. I remember, I don't know, 15 years ago or so, there was a similar program in Europe. I remember, especially in the UK, I was in the UK at that time to improve my English, and there was a program where you traded in your old car and buy a new, more efficient car, then you got subsidized pretty heavily.
Yeah, it was similar in the U.S. That they had a similar program. It was called Cash for Clunkers, I think it was called. And it's interesting the effects on it, because it destroyed the used car market.
Yeah.
But every person could potentially, not every person, but a lot more people could potentially benefit. But to see China break it down even further, and we're not talking about a $15,000, $20,000, $30,000, $40,000 purchase. You're talking about a $500 purchase, even less.
Yeah.
And just the different level of economics of where it's being applied and who's going to be able to kind of capitalize on that. And it'll be fascinating to watch where they kind of go. If it pushes their domestic, I guess, economy, if it has some waning side effects, we'll see. And that's always the question, is how much can we believe the numbers that we do see in that?
Right.
Urs, thank you so much for today. It was a really good talk. I appreciate it. And I look forward to the next time we get to sit down and talk about the economy.
Great.